Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The morning broke over the village, its air thick with Tet's promise, but the clamor of angry voices shattered the quiet. Workers crowded James's gate, their hands rough with labor, their eyes sharp with hunger, demanding wages unpaid for 3 months. Why did the dam stop? They shouted, their words a storm, blaming him for fields gone dry, for families that starved. Diep stood by her shack, her heart a fragile thread, torn by the chaos, by James's absence, by a fear that his love, her anchor, might crumble under truths she couldn't name. Hockey whined at her feet, his loyalty a quiet him, but her hands trembled, scattering feed for chickens, her mind racing to the man who'd taught her to read, to dream, to believe she was enough. The phone in her pocket, his gift, was a weight, a vow to learn, but now it pulsed with doubt, a mirror to a heart that wavered, torn between love and a storm she sensed but couldn't see. The workers' voices were a blade, cutting through the village's hum. 3 months without pay, one cried, his face lined with years, his children's hunger a shadow in his eyes. The dam's dead, no water for our fields, another roared, and Diep flinched, her hands still, knowing their pain, their fields like hers, dependent on a dream, the twin-son hydroelectric project, that had stalled. James emerged, his face pale, his voice steady but tight. Calm down, he said, his hands raised, his heart racing under their gaze. Our contract pays every 3 months. We're delayed, I'm sorry. Give me 3 days. The workers muttered, their phones flashing, recording his vow. 3 days, he repeated, and if I fail, I'll pay 4 months' wages. His words were a gamble, a vow to hold a company cracking under betrayal, and Diep watched, her heart torn, wondering what truths he hid, what storms he faced alone. Her shack was a haven, its walls warm with memory, its yard alive with hockey's scamper and the cluck of chickens. She'd built this life from ashes, orphaned young, betrayed by an uncle, married at 16 to a man whose fists broke her dreams. She'd fled, her name her only map, and found James, his truck stuck in mud, her laughter shy as she pushed. You're enough, he'd said, and she believed, her heart opening to a man who saw her scars and called them stars. The phone, his gift, was a bridge to a world she feared, letters she'd forgotten, a screen she fumbled, but she tried, her tears falling alone, her love for him a flame that flickered but held. Now as she knelt by hockey, his warmth a bomb, she scattered feed, the chickens chatter him to a life she'd forged, but her heart was torn, heavy with a call she'd missed, a whisper that James was in trouble. The call had come at dawn, Tuan's voice sharp with worry. James is in the hospital, he'd said, and Diep had run, her sandals slipping on mud, her heart racing, her fear a storm that drowned Tet's glow. The hospital was cold, its halls heavy with antiseptic, and she found him, his face pale, his eyes soft but distant. I'm exhausted, he'd said, his voice a thread, and she'd wept, her hands trembling, her heart torn by his silence, by the truths he kept. She cooked porridge, its steam a vow, and sat by his bed, her voice low, her words a plea. Why do you hide from me? She asked, her tears falling, her pain raw. You taught me to read, to live, but not to care for you. I'm nothing without you, James, but you suffer alone. Her words were a mirror to her past, a girl orphaned, a woman who'd learned love through him, and she clung to him, her heart torn, fearing he'd slip away. James's eyes held a storm, their depths heavy with secrets. I'm sorry, he said, his hand on hers, his warmth a vow that held her still. I'm protecting you. But her heart raced, her doubt a shadow that grew, and she pressed, her voice a whisper. Protect me by sharing, not hiding. He smiled, his face pale, and she stayed, her hands busy with porridge, her heart wide as the hills, her love a flame that burned despite the pain. The hospital hummed, its lights harsh, but her presence was a hymn, a vow to stand by him, to mend a heart torn by truths she couldn't name. She thought of hockey waiting at home, of the chickens she'd fed, of the red bean seeds she'd sown, each act a prayer for James, for a life beyond the shack's patched roof. His company was a wreck, its foundations cracked by betrayal. The twin-son project, meant to bring water and power to farmers, had cost 10 billion dong, now 5 billion in debt, with 3 billion owed to workers. John, the investor, had pulled his capital, bribed others to follow, and hired men to stir the workers' rage. James had planned it, Tuan revealed, his voice low in the hospital's shadow. He let the company falter to draw John out, Tuan said, and Diep's heart sank, her mind racing, her fear a storm that grew. John was no mere investor. He was a smuggling lord from Thailand, his wealth a blade, his heart heavy with vengeance. Your family ruined mine, he told James, his words a poison, and Diep faltered, her hands still, wondering what sins James's father bore, what truths lay buried in the past. James had gambled, his hospital bed a stage, his illness a lie to lure John. The doctor confirmed it, his voice dry. "He's not sick," he said, and Diep's heart shattered, her tears falling, her voice sharp with betrayal. "You lied to me," she cried, and James flinched, his eyes soft, his hands reaching. "I had to," he said, his voice low, his fear raw. "John would hurt you." She stood, her heart torn, her love a flame that flickered, and he rose, his steps unsteady, his arms wide. "Let me carry you home," he said, his voice a vow, and she laughed, her tears falling, her anger easing, his warmth a bridge to a love she couldn't lose. They walked, his arms strong, her heart heavy but held, and she clung to him, her doubt a shadow that lingered, a truth she feared to face. The village was alive, its lanterns glowing, Tet's hum a promise of hope. Diep's shack was a world, its walls warm with memory, its air heavy with hockey's wines. She'd returned, her hands busy with feed, her heart racing with James's vow. "I'll tell you soon," he'd said, his voice soft, his eyes sharp with resolve, and she'd nodded, her fear raw but easing, her love a hymn that held her still. The chickens clucked, their feathers bright, and she smiled, her dream of a farm, a life with James, a spark that warmed her shack. But the workers' voices lingered, their anger a fire, and she thought of their fields, their hunger, their hope in a dam that stood silent, a dream betrayed by John's hand. James's office was a cage, its walls heavy with debt. He'd sat, his mind torn between John's shadow and Diep's light, and vowed to fight, to hold his world, to keep her safe. The papers, their ink a map of trust broken, were a fragile shield, their success a gamble. He'd thought of the farmers, their fields dry, their hands rough with hope, and smiled, his heart steady, his love a vow that held him still. The workers' voices were a storm, their need a mirror to his own, and he'd vowed to pay, to fight John, to hold the dam that meant more than wealth. It meant life for them, for Diep, for a village that cradled his heart. But John's words, "You're going to jail," were a blade, and he faltered, his heart racing, his plan a gamble that could cost everything. Tuan's voice was a thread, his loyalty a vow. "The wood workshop has capital," he'd said, and James had nodded, his mind racing, his plan clear. 8 billion dong to save the dam, to pay the workers, to hold a dream that wasn't his alone. The project was for the farmers, for fields that thirsted, for a village that suffered, and he'd poured his heart into it, his wealth a vow to ease their pain. But John's betrayal had cracked it, his bribes a poison, his rage a fire that burned. James had met him, his voice low, his eyes sharp. "I know who you are," he'd said, and John had laughed, his face a mask, his words a blade. "Your father's sins are yours," he'd said, and James had stood, his heart heavy, his resolve a flame that burned, knowing the truth, knowing the cost. Diep's garden was a hymn, its leaves glistening with dew, its earth soft with promise. She'd sown red bean seeds, her hands steady, her heart torn but held, and thought of James, of the hospital, of a love that endured despite the pain. Hockey scampered, his warmth a balm, and she smiled, her tears falling, her dream of a farm. A life with him, a spark that glowed. The phone, its buttons a puzzle, was more than a gift. It was a vow to rise, to learn, to stand by him, and she tried, her heart wide, her fear a shadow she pushed away. James had called, his voice a quiet strength, and she'd listened, her heart racing, her hands still. "You're enough," he'd said, and she'd clung to it, her love a flame that burned, her doubt a whisper that lingered, a truth she feared to face. The workers had dispersed, their phones heavy with his vow, their hope a fragile thread. 3 days, he'd said, and they'd nodded, their eyes sharp, their need a fire that burned. James had stood, his heart heavy, his plan a gamble that held their lives, their fields, their dreams. He'd thought of Diep, of her porridge, of her tears, and smiled, his heart steady, his love a vow that held him still. John's shadow loomed, his bribes a poison, his rage a storm, but James had evidence, a thread to pull, a truth to wield. The lawyer Tieu was John's pawn, but James had others, their loyalty a shield, their hands ready to fight. Diep's shack was a world, its walls warm with memory, its air heavy with hope. She'd knelt by Hockey, his warmth a quiet balm and scattered feed, the chickens chatter a hymn to a life she'd built. The porridge, her gift to James, was more than food. It was a vow, a promise to stand by him, to mend a heart torn by truth she couldn't name. She'd called him, her voice soft, her heart racing, and listened, her fear raw but easing. "I'm busy," he'd said, his voice tight, and she'd nodded, her tears falling, her heart lifting, his faith a bridge to a future she couldn't see. The phone, its buttons a puzzle, was a dream, a vow to learn, to rise, to stand by him, and she clung to it, her love a flame that flickered but held. James's hospital room was a stage, its walls heavy with lies. He'd sat, his mind torn between John's shadow and Diep's light, and vowed to fight, to hold his world, to keep her safe. The papers, their ink a map of trust broken, were a fragile shield, their success a gamble. He'd thought of the farmers, their fields dry, their hands rough with hope, and smiled, his heart steady, his love a vow that held him still. The workers' voices lingered, their anger a fire he'd face, and he'd vowed to pay, to fight John, to hold the dam that meant more than wealth. It meant life for them, for Diepp, for a village that cradled his heart. But John's words, "I'm the smuggling boss," were a blade, and he faltered, his heart racing, his plan a gamble that could cost everything. Tieu was coming, its lanterns aglow against the dark, a promise of fortune she wanted to hold. Diep thought of James, his voice, his hands on her arm, his love a balm to her wound. He'd spoken of a farm, of fields heavy with grain, of a life they'd build, and she'd smiled, her heart wide as the hills. But her past lingered, a chain that whispered she wasn't enough, and John's shadow, the workers' anger, were clouds over James's world. The phone in her hand, the porridge she'd cooked, were steps toward a future she couldn't see. And the love she gave, to James, to hockey, to strangers with heavy bags, was a choice she made each day. She thought of the market, the pumpkins she'd sold, the water she'd given, the love that held them close. James had called, his voice a quiet strength, and she'd smiled, her heart racing, her hands still from scattering feed. "You're enough," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her fear raw but easing, his words a bridge to a future she couldn't see. The chickens clucked, their feathers bright in the dusk, and she smiled, her dream of a farm, a life with James, a spark that warmed her shack. James would come, his love a vow that held her still, but John's shadow, the workers' need, were storms she couldn't name. The games of Tieu were near, their cheers a hum she'd hear, and she thought of the market, its voices loud with hope. James had listened, his eyes soft with pride, and she'd smiled, her heart heavy with doubt. Enough for him, for his world? She'd fed the chickens, tended hockey, and thought of the phone, her labor in the fields. James had stayed, his voice low with plans. "We'll build," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her heart trembling, her eyes on the fields, their green a hope she clung to. Her past was a wound, but his faith was a balm, and she wanted to trust it, to believe it could endure the storm. Questions lingered, soft as moonlight, heavy as earth. Would she rise or falter under John's shadow? Would James unravel the betrayal, or lose his world to the workers' anger? Would her love, her heart torn by truths, hold strong, or would doubt, hers, his worlds, pull them apart? She thought of the chickens, the field she'd worked, the love that held her heart close, and James's voice, "You're enough," a vow that warmed her shack. Would their dream endure, a seed in Tieu's glow, or wither under storms too heavy? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound, faint but deep, that pulsed with every breath. Sleep would come later, broken by hockey's whines and the creak of the shack's walls. For now, Diep stood by the stream, the moon high, the village quiet save for its endless hymn. She thought of James, of his lies, of the love they'd forged in dust and pain. The answers weren't here, not yet. They lay beyond the hills in a dawn she couldn't see, and as she turned back to the shack, her steps steady, her soul burned, a flame that trembled but didn't die.